The radio crackled with static as Captain Sarah Chun adjusted her helmet, the desert sun blazing through the cockpit of her H-64 Apache helicopter. Somewhere in the distance, enemy fighters were closing in, but at that moment, she was laughing at her co-pilot's terrible joke about military coffee. In 30 seconds, that laughter would save her life, and in 3 minutes, it would haunt her dreams forever. This is the story of a pilot who discovered that sometimes the difference between life and death isn't about skill, training, or luck. It's about the split second when you choose to laugh instead of fear, even when the sky is falling around you. B. Captain Sarah Chun had been flying Apache helicopters for 8 years, but she had never felt as alive as she did during that scorching afternoon in the contested airspace over Syria. The mission briefing that morning had been routine: provide close air support for a ground reconnaissance team that was moving through a valley suspected of harboring enemy ammunition supplies. What they hadn't expected was to stumble into what military intelligence would later classify as one of the most sophisticated aerial ambushes of the entire conflict. Sarah's co-pilot and gunner, Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, had been her flying partner for 2 years. They had developed the kind of wordless communication that only comes from countless hours of shared danger, where a slight shift in breathing or a barely perceptible change in posture could communicate volumes. Marcus was known throughout their squadron for his terrible sense of humor, a quality that had initially annoyed Sarah, but had gradually become one of the things she valued most about their partnership. In the high-stress environment of combat aviation, his ability to find something to laugh about had saved both their sanity more times than she could count. The Apache they were flying that day, tail number 07-03684, had been Sarah's bird for the past 6 months. She knew every sound the engines made, every slight vibration in the controls, every quirk in the avionics systems. The helicopter had taken her through 43 combat missions without a single mechanical failure, and she had developed the kind of superstitious attachment to the aircraft that all combat pilots understand but rarely discuss. She had a small photo of her daughter tucked behind one of the instrument panels, and a lucky coin that her father had carried during his tour in Vietnam taped to her collective control. The morning had started like any other mission day. Sarah woke at 0445 hours in the temporary quarters that served as home for their forward operating base. The base was little more than a collection of prefabricated buildings, concrete barriers, and a hastily constructed runway that could barely accommodate the needs of their small aviation unit. She had learned to sleep through the constant noise of generators, radio chatter, and the occasional incoming mortar round, but that morning she had been awakened by something else entirely: complete silence. The silence turned out to be caused by a temporary power outage, but it had left Sarah with an uneasy feeling that persisted through her morning routine. She had always been somewhat superstitious about missions, and the unusual quiet felt like an omen. She tried to shake off the feeling as she made her way to the mess hall for breakfast, where she found Marcus already nursing his second cup of coffee and reading a weeks-old newspaper that someone had managed to acquire from a supply run. The mission briefing had been conducted by Major Thompson, their squadron leader, who had a reputation for thorough preparation and an almost obsessive attention to detail. The intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces had been using the target valley as a supply route, moving ammunition and equipment under cover of darkness. The reconnaissance team would move in on foot to gather photographic evidence and identify specific targets for future airstrikes. Sarah and Marcus were assigned as their guardian angels, providing overwatch and ready to engage any threats that emerged. What the intelligence reports had failed to mention was that enemy forces had been aware of American interest in the valley for weeks. They had been carefully planning an ambush that would demonstrate their ability to challenge American air superiority in a way that would send shockwaves through the entire theater of operations. They had positioned mobile surface-to-air missile systems in carefully concealed locations throughout the surrounding hills, and they had coordinated with a squadron of aging but still deadly fighter jets that had been modified specifically for this kind of engagement. The pre-flight inspection of the Apache had revealed nothing unusual. Sarah methodically checked every system, every weapon, every piece of equipment that might mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe. The helicopter carried a full complement of Hellfire missiles, a 30mm chain gun with 1,500 rounds of ammunition, and enough fuel for nearly 3 hours of flight time. The aircraft's sophisticated sensor systems were functioning perfectly, and the communication equipment had been tested and retested to ensure reliable contact with both the ground team and their base operations center. As they lifted off from the forward operating base, Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied the beginning of every combat mission. The Apache rose smoothly into the morning air, its twin engines producing the distinctive whine that had become the soundtrack of her military career. Below them, the landscape stretched out in endless variations of brown and tan, broken occasionally by the dark green of irrigation ditches or the geometric patterns of abandoned agricultural fields. The flight to the target area took 45 minutes, during which Sarah and Marcus maintained a constant stream of radio communication with their base, the reconnaissance team, and other aircraft in the area. The radio chatter was routine and professional, covering everything from weather conditions to fuel consumption rates to the latest intelligence updates. It was the kind of background noise that Sarah had learned to filter automatically, focusing only on the information that was directly relevant to their mission. As they approached the valley, Sarah began to notice small details that didn't quite fit the intelligence picture they had been given. There were no visible signs of recent vehicle traffic on the roads, which seemed odd for a supply route that was supposedly in active use. The few buildings scattered throughout the area showed no evidence of recent occupation. Most significantly, there were no signs of the kind of defensive preparations that enemy forces typically established around important supply lines. Marcus was the first to voice what they were both thinking. The area looked too clean, too empty, too perfect. It felt like a stage that had been carefully prepared for a performance, but they couldn't yet see who the intended audience might be. Sarah increased their altitude slightly and began a wider, circular patrol pattern that would allow them to observe the entire valley while remaining outside the effective range of most shoulder-fired missiles. The reconnaissance team had been on the ground for 30 minutes when they reported finding evidence of recent military activity in one of the larger buildings near the center of the valley. Sarah maneuvered the Apache to a position where she could provide overwatch while Marcus prepared the targeting systems in case they needed to provide close air support. Everything seemed to be proceeding according to plan. It was at that moment that Marcus chose to tell Sarah his joke about military coffee being the only substance on Earth that could simultaneously keep you awake and put you to sleep. The joke was terrible, as his jokes always were, but something about the timing and his delivery struck Sarah as hilarious. She found herself laughing harder than the joke deserved, a deep, genuine laugh that seemed to come from somewhere she hadn't accessed in months. She was still laughing when the first surface-to-air missile streaked past their cockpit, missing them by less than 20 feet. The proximity alarm screamed, and Sarah's laughter died in her throat as she realized they were under attack. But in that split second of confusion, as her mind shifted from humor to horror, she inadvertently made the control input that would save both their lives. The missile had been fired from a position that military intelligence had classified as clear of enemy activity. As Sarah threw the Apache into an emergency evasive maneuver, she could see at least 3 more missile contrails rising from concealed positions scattered throughout the hills surrounding the valley. The ambush had been planned with a level of sophistication that spoke to months of preparation and detailed knowledge of American tactical procedures. Marcus immediately began working the defensive systems, launching chaff and flares while simultaneously trying to identify the source of the missile fire. The Apache's onboard computers were registering multiple radar contacts, including at least 2 aircraft approaching from the east at high speed and low altitude. Sarah realized with growing dread that they weren't just dealing with surface-to-air missiles. They were facing a coordinated attack involving both ground-based and airborne threats. The radio erupted with urgent communications from multiple sources. The ground reconnaissance team was reporting that they were under fire from automatic weapons and were requesting immediate extraction. The base operations center was trying to coordinate additional air support, but the nearest friendly aircraft were at least 15 minutes away. Most ominously, an Air Force radar station was reporting multiple unidentified aircraft crossing the border and heading directly toward their position. Sarah's training kicked in with the kind of automatic precision that comes from countless hours of simulator work and real-world experience. She put the Apache into a rapid descent, using the terrain to mask their position while simultaneously positioning them to provide covering fire for the ground team. The helicopter's sophisticated sensor systems were painting a picture of the tactical situation that was both clear and terrifying. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a carefully prepared killing zone. The first enemy fighter appeared over the ridge line like something from a nightmare. It was an aging MiG-21, but it had been modified with modern avionics and weapon systems that made it far more dangerous than its obsolete appearance suggested. The pilot was clearly experienced, using the mountainous terrain to mask his approach and positioning his aircraft to take advantage of the Apache's momentary vulnerability as Sarah maneuvered to support the ground team. Marcus engaged the first missile site with a Hellfire missile, scoring a direct hit that sent a pillar of black smoke rising from the hillside. But even as he was celebrating the successful engagement, 2 more missile sites revealed their positions by opening fire simultaneously. Sarah realized that they were dealing with a level of tactical coordination that suggested extensive training and possibly foreign military advisors. The MiG pilot made his first attack run just as Sarah was pulling the Apache out of its dive. The 30mm cannon fire from the fighter aircraft walked across the ground directly beneath their position, close enough that Sarah could see the impact flashes in her peripheral vision. She threw the helicopter into a violent sideways slide that pushed both her and Marcus hard against their restraining harnesses, but it was exactly the kind of aggressive defensive maneuvering that the Apache had been designed to handle. The ground team situation was deteriorating rapidly. Their radio communications indicated that they were surrounded by enemy infantry and were running low on ammunition. The team leader, Sergeant First Class Williams, was requesting immediate close air support, but Sarah was facing the tactical nightmare that every combat pilot dreads, multiple simultaneous threats that prevented her from effectively engaging any of them. Marcus managed to get a radar lock on the MiG during its second attack run, but the pilot was too experienced to present an easy target. The enemy fighter disappeared behind the ridge line before Marcus could launch a missile, and Sarah knew that he would reappear from a different direction, probably with additional aircraft in support. The tactical situation was evolving too rapidly for them to maintain the initiative. It was during this moment of tactical crisis that Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for years afterward. Instead of withdrawing to a safe distance and calling for additional air support, she chose to press the attack on the remaining missile sites while simultaneously attempting to provide close air support for the surrounded reconnaissance team. It was the kind of aggressive decision that had made her reputation as a combat pilot, but it also placed her Apache directly in the center of the killing zone that enemy forces had spent months preparing. The second MiG appeared from the north, approaching at treetop level in an attack profile that took advantage of every piece of available terrain masking. Sarah realized that the 2 enemy pilots were coordinating their attacks, forcing her to defend against threats from multiple directions while preventing her from maintaining effective overwatch of the ground situation. It was a textbook example of aerial tactics designed specifically to counter the Apache's advantages in close air support operations. Marcus scored hits on 2 more missile sites, but each successful engagement revealed their position to additional enemy forces. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different locations as enemy infantry opened fire with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. The Apache's armor was designed to withstand small arms fire, but she knew that their luck couldn't hold indefinitely against such concentrated fire. The radio communications from the ground team were becoming increasingly desperate. Sergeant Williams reported that 2 of his men were wounded and that they were down to their last few magazines of ammunition. He was requesting permission to attempt a fighting withdrawal to a landing zone where they might be extracted, but Sarah could see that the terrain and the enemy positions made such a withdrawal virtually impossible. The tactical situation demanded a choice that no pilot should ever have to make. Sarah could either maintain her defensive position and hope that additional air support would arrive in time to save the ground team, or she could make an aggressive attack on the enemy positions surrounding the reconnaissance team, knowing that such an attack would expose her Apache to devastating fire from the remaining missile sites and the circling MiG fighters. Sarah's decision was influenced by a factor that wouldn't appear in any after-action report or tactical analysis. As she weighed the tactical options, she found herself thinking about Marcus's terrible joke and the moment of laughter they had shared just minutes earlier. In that moment of pure human connection, she had been reminded of why they were fighting and what they were fighting for. The reconnaissance team on the ground wasn't just a tactical objective. They were fellow soldiers whose lives depended on her willingness to accept risk on their behalf. She keyed her radio and informed the base operations center that she was going to attempt a close air support mission despite the hostile air activity. The response was immediate and predictable. She was ordered to withdraw to a safe distance and wait for additional air support. But Sarah had already begun her attack run, diving toward the enemy positions with Marcus preparing to engage multiple targets simultaneously. The Apache screamed down toward the valley floor with both pilots, knowing that they were committing themselves to a course of action that offered no easy escape route. Behind them, the MiGs were positioning for another coordinated attack, and ahead of them, enemy forces were preparing to concentrate their fire on a single helicopter that was presenting itself as the most obvious target in the entire battle space. The attack run began with Marcus engaging 3 enemy infantry positions in rapid succession with the Apache's 30mm chain gun. The distinctive sound of the cannon firing filled the cockpit with a rhythmic hammering that Sarah felt as much as heard. Each burst was precisely aimed, walking across enemy positions that had been carefully concealed among the rocks and vegetation of the valley floor. Enemy soldiers scattered from their positions, some returning fire with automatic weapons, while others attempted to reposition portable anti-aircraft missiles for a clear shot at the attacking helicopter. Sarah flew the Apache with an aggression that surprised even Marcus, who had flown with her through dozens of combat missions. She kept the helicopter moving in an unpredictable pattern that made it difficult for enemy forces to track their movement, while simultaneously maintaining the stable gun platform that Marcus needed to engage multiple targets effectively. It was a demonstration of flying skill that represented the culmination of years of training and combat experience. The first MiG reappeared during the middle of their attack run, approaching from the west in a high-speed dive that brought it directly into Marcus's engagement envelope. For a brief moment, Sarah had a clear choice. She could either continue the attack on the ground targets, or she could maneuver to give Marcus the best possible shot at the enemy fighter. She chose to continue the attack on the ground positions, trusting Marcus to handle the aerial threat while she focused on saving the reconnaissance team. Marcus launched an air-to-air missile at the MiG while simultaneously engaging a rocket-propelled grenade team that was attempting to target the Apache from a position near the reconnaissance team's location. The missile missed the fighter by mere yards, close enough to force the enemy pilot to break off his attack, but not close enough to score the kill that would have eliminated the aerial threat. The RPG team disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris, but Sarah knew that additional enemy forces were moving to replace them. The reconnaissance team used the covering fire to begin a tactical withdrawal toward a more defensible position near the base of the valley's eastern slope. Sergeant Williams coordinated the movement with the kind of professional competence that Sarah had learned to expect from special operations soldiers, but she could hear the strain in his voice as he reported additional casualties and dwindling ammunition supplies. The team was holding together, but they were clearly approaching the limits of their endurance. The second MiG made its attack from the south, timing its approach to coincide with Sarah's most vulnerable moment as she pulled the Apache out of its dive. The enemy pilot fired a burst from his cannon that passed close enough to the helicopter that Sarah could hear the distinctive crack of supersonic projectiles passing nearby. She threw the Apache into a violent evasive maneuver that saved their lives, but temporarily broke Marcus's engagement with the ground targets. It was during this moment of tactical confusion that Sarah noticed something that changed her understanding of the entire engagement. The enemy forces on the ground were not simply defending prepared positions. They were executing a carefully choreographed withdrawal that was designed to funnel the Apache into an even more sophisticated trap. The missile sites that Marcus had destroyed were not the primary threat. They had been sacrificial positions designed to reveal the Apache's capabilities and draw it into the range of more advanced weapon systems. Sarah realized that they were facing an enemy that had studied American tactical procedures in detail and had prepared countermeasures for every standard response. The MiG pilots were not simply opportunistic attackers. They were part of a coordinated plan that was designed to achieve a propaganda victory by shooting down an American Apache helicopter in circumstances that would demonstrate sophisticated tactical planning and execution. The radio crackled with an urgent transmission from the Air Force radar station. Additional enemy aircraft were approaching from multiple directions, including what appeared to be at least 2 more fighters and possibly a dedicated air-to-air refueling aircraft that would allow the enemy fighters to maintain their attack for an extended period. Sarah realized that they were not just facing a tactical ambush. They were confronting a strategic operation that had been planned at the highest levels of enemy command. Marcus managed to establish communications with the approaching friendly aircraft, but the news was not encouraging. The nearest air support was still more than 10 minutes away, and the incoming aircraft were configured for air-to-ground attack rather than air-to-air combat. Sarah would have to keep her Apache alive and continue providing support for the ground team while facing aerial threats that she was not equipped to handle effectively. The tactical situation demanded a level of improvisation that went far beyond standard operating procedures. Sarah began using the mountainous terrain in ways that the Apache's designers had never intended, flying through narrow canyons and using cliff faces to mask her approach routes. It was dangerous flying that pushed both the aircraft and her own skills to their absolute limits, but it was also the only way to maintain the element of surprise against enemy forces that had clearly anticipated every standard tactical response. The reconnaissance team reached their fallback position just as the 3rd MiG appeared over the valley. This aircraft was different from the others, newer, with more sophisticated avionics and weapon systems that immediately changed the tactical equation. Sarah realized that they were no longer facing obsolete Soviet-era fighters flown by inadequately trained pilots. The new aircraft represented a level of military capability that suggested direct involvement by a major military power. Marcus scored a direct hit on what appeared to be a command post, triggering a secondary explosion that suggested the presence of stored ammunition or fuel. The explosion created a momentary distraction that allowed Sarah to reposition the Apache for another attack run, but it also revealed their location to every enemy force in the valley. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least a dozen different positions as enemy infantry opened fire with everything from assault rifles to heavy machine guns. The new MiG pilot demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that immediately placed him in a different category from his predecessors. Instead of making direct attack runs that exposed his aircraft to defensive fire, he began using the terrain to establish a tactical pattern that gradually reduced Sarah's maneuvering options while maintaining pressure on both the Apache and the ground team. Sarah realized that she was facing a pilot with extensive training in countering American helicopter operations. It was at this moment that Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of the engagement. Instead of continuing to react to enemy initiatives, she decided to seize the tactical initiative by doing something that no enemy planner would have anticipated. She would use the Apache's unique capabilities to turn the carefully prepared ambush into an opportunity to destroy enemy forces that had exposed themselves in order to spring their trap. Sarah keyed her radio and informed Marcus of her plan. They would use the Apache's superior maneuverability and firepower to systematically engage each enemy position while using aggressive evasive maneuvering to avoid the aerial threats. It was a plan that required perfect coordination between pilot and gunner, absolute trust in their aircraft's capabilities, and a level of aggressive flying that bordered on reckless. Marcus responded with characteristic humor, making another terrible joke about the situation before confirming his readiness to engage multiple targets simultaneously. His voice carried the same calm professionalism that had sustained them through dozens of previous combat missions. But Sarah could detect an underlying tension that reflected their shared understanding of the extraordinary risks they were about to accept. Sarah initiated her counterattack by flying the Apache directly toward the most heavily defended enemy position, using the helicopter's speed and maneuverability to close the distance before enemy gunners could establish effective tracking solutions. Marcus engaged multiple targets simultaneously with the chain gun, while Sarah maneuvered to avoid incoming fire from both ground-based weapons and the circling MiG fighters. It was a demonstration of combat aviation that pushed both crew and aircraft to their absolute operational limits. The advanced MiG pilot responded to Sarah's aggressive tactics by attempting to establish a firing position that would allow him to engage the Apache during its attack run. But Sarah had anticipated this response, and she timed her attack to coincide with the enemy fighter's most vulnerable moment as it maneuvered for position. Marcus launched their last air-to-air missile during this brief window of opportunity, forcing the enemy pilot to break off his attack and begin defensive maneuvering. The missile detonated close enough to the MiG to cause visible damage to the aircraft's wing and engine, but not close enough to achieve a kill. The enemy pilot managed to maintain control of his aircraft, but his maneuvering capabilities were clearly reduced. Sarah realized that they had achieved a tactical advantage that might allow them to complete their mission, but only if they could maintain pressure on all enemy forces simultaneously. The reconnaissance team used the distraction created by the aerial engagement to begin advancing toward a helicopter landing zone that Sarah had identified during her initial reconnaissance of the valley. Sergeant Williams coordinated the movement with clockwork precision, but Sarah could see that the team was moving more slowly than optimal, indicating that their casualties were more serious than their radio communications had suggested. Marcus systematically engaged each enemy position that threatened the ground team's movement, scoring direct hits on machine gun nests and mortar positions that had been carefully concealed among the natural terrain features. His accuracy was extraordinary, considering the difficulty of engaging multiple small targets from a rapidly maneuvering aircraft while simultaneously monitoring threats from enemy fighters. It was a demonstration of gunnery skill that represented the culmination of years of intensive training. The damaged MiG made one final attack run, approaching from an unexpected direction that brought it into range just as Sarah was coordinating with the ground team for extraction. The enemy pilot's attack was desperate, but effective, walking cannon fire across the landscape close enough to the Apache that Sarah could feel the shock waves from the explosions. She responded with an evasive maneuver that saved their lives, but temporarily broke her visual contact with the reconnaissance team. It was during this moment of tactical confusion that Sarah heard something that would haunt her dreams for years afterward. Over the radio, she could hear the distinctive laughter of one of the reconnaissance team members, a young soldier named Private Johnson who had developed a reputation for maintaining his sense of humor even under the most difficult circumstances. His laughter was a response to something that Sergeant Williams had said about their situation, but to Sarah, it sounded like an echo of her own laughter from the beginning of the engagement. The laughter lasted for perhaps 3 seconds before being cut off by the sound of an explosion. A mortar round had detonated near the team's position, and when communications were re-established, Private Johnson was no longer responding to radio calls. Sarah realized with growing dread that the young soldier who had been laughing just moments before had been killed by enemy fire that might have been avoided if she had maintained better overwatch of their position. Marcus attempted to engage the mortar position that had fired the fatal round, but the enemy gunners had already moved to a new location. The Apache's sensors were detecting multiple new threats, including what appeared to be additional missile sites that had remained concealed throughout the earlier phases of the engagement. Sarah realized that the enemy plan had included multiple layers of contingency preparations, and they were now facing the final phase of an ambush that had been designed to achieve maximum psychological impact. The arriving friendly aircraft appeared on the horizon just as Sarah was beginning to run dangerously low on fuel. The incoming fighters were configured for air-to-air combat and immediately engaged the surviving MiG fighters, creating the aerial cover that Sarah needed to complete the extraction of the reconnaissance team. But the cost of the engagement was becoming clear. Private Johnson was dead, 2 other team members were seriously wounded, and the Apache had sustained damage that would require extensive maintenance. Sarah maneuvered the Apache to the improvised landing zone where the reconnaissance team was waiting for extraction. The helicopter touched down under fire from enemy positions that were still being suppressed by Marcus's cannon fire, and the wounded soldiers were loaded aboard with the kind of efficient professionalism that characterized special operations personnel. Sergeant Williams was the last aboard, and his grim expression told Sarah everything she needed to know about the cost of their mission. The extraction flight back to base was conducted under escort by the newly arrived fighter aircraft, but Sarah's attention was focused on the medical emergency that was unfolding in the passenger compartment behind her. The Apache's medic was working to stabilize the wounded soldiers, but it was clear that they needed immediate access to advanced medical facilities. Sarah pushed the Apache to its maximum speed, knowing that every minute could mean the difference between life and death for the wounded men. The landing at their forward operating base was met by medical personnel who had been alerted to prepare for multiple casualties. The wounded soldiers were transferred to waiting ambulances within minutes of touchdown. But Sarah knew that the true cost of the engagement would not be measured solely in terms of immediate casualties. The psychological impact of losing Private Johnson, combined with the realization that they had been drawn into a carefully prepared trap, would affect every member of the unit. The post-mission debriefing revealed the full scope of the enemy operation that had been waiting for them in the valley. Intelligence analysts determined that the ambush had been planned for months, possibly with assistance from military advisors with detailed knowledge of American tactical procedures. The enemy had achieved their primary objective of demonstrating their ability to challenge American air superiority, even though they had ultimately failed to destroy the Apache or prevent the extraction of the reconnaissance team. Sarah's performance during the engagement was officially recognized as exceptional, and she was recommended for a commendation that would acknowledge her skill and courage under extremely difficult circumstances. But she found herself focusing on those 3 seconds of laughter that had preceded Private Johnson's death, wondering whether different tactical decisions on her part might have prevented the tragedy. The Apache that had carried them through the engagement was retired from service, pending extensive maintenance to repair battle damage and replace worn components. Sarah would fly other aircraft during the remainder of her deployment, but she never again experienced the same level of confidence in her equipment and her own abilities that had sustained her through dozens of previous combat missions. The weeks following the ambush in the valley marked a fundamental change in how Sarah approached her responsibilities as a combat pilot. The official investigation into the engagement concluded that she and Marcus had performed exceptionally under extremely difficult circumstances, and that their actions had prevented what could have been a complete disaster for the reconnaissance team. But Sarah found herself increasingly haunted by the memory of Private Johnson's laughter and the 3-second gap between humor and tragedy that had defined the moment of his death. The psychological impact of the engagement extended far beyond Sarah's personal struggles. The entire squadron was affected by the realization that enemy forces had achieved a level of tactical sophistication that called into question many of their standard operating procedures. Intelligence briefings revealed that similar ambushes were being prepared in other areas of operation, and that American forces were facing an enemy that had learned to exploit the predictability of their tactics and procedures. Sarah's relationship with Marcus also changed during this period. Their partnership had been based on mutual trust and shared humor, but The trauma of the Valley engagement had created a barrier that neither of them was equipped to address directly. Marcus continued to tell his terrible jokes, but Sarah found herself unable to laugh with the same spontaneous joy that had characterized their previous flights together. The laughter that had once been a source of strength became a reminder of loss and vulnerability. The medical report on the wounded reconnaissance team members provided some relief from Sarah's guilt about the engagement. Both soldiers recovered from their injuries and returned to duty, and Sergeant Williams wrote a letter to Sarah expressing his gratitude for the air support that had enabled their survival. But these positive developments could not eliminate Sarah's focus on the soldier they had lost or her growing conviction that different tactical decisions might have prevented his death. Sarah's commanding officer, Major Thompson, recognized the signs of combat stress and arranged for her to meet with a military psychologist who specialized in helping aircrew cope with traumatic experiences. The sessions were helpful in providing Sarah with tools for managing her emotional responses to combat situations, but they also forced her to confront questions about the nature of warfare and the psychological costs of military service that she had previously avoided. The psychologist helped Sarah understand that her focus on Private Johnson's laughter was part of a normal psychological response to traumatic loss. The human mind naturally searches for patterns and connections that might explain tragic events, and Sarah's fixation on those 3 seconds of humor before disaster represented her attempt to find meaning in circumstances that were ultimately beyond her control. Understanding this pattern helped Sarah begin to process her grief without abandoning her sense of responsibility as a military officer. The technical analysis of the Apache's performance during the engagement revealed several areas where improvements could be made to enhance aircrew survival in similar situations. The helicopter's defensive systems had performed adequately, but the engagement had exposed vulnerabilities in communication protocols and tactical procedures that could be addressed through modified training programs and equipment updates. Sarah participated in these improvement efforts, finding that contributing to enhanced safety measures helped her process her own experience in a constructive way. Sarah's final combat mission of her deployment took place 3 months after the Valley engagement. She was assigned to provide air support for a humanitarian relief operation in an area that intelligence reports indicated was free of significant enemy activity. The mission proceeded without incident, but Sarah found herself hyper-aware of every radio transmission and suspicious of every tactical situation that seemed too routine or too perfect. The flight home from deployment gave Sarah time to reflect on how the Valley engagement had changed her understanding of her own capabilities and limitations as a military officer. She had always taken pride in her ability to handle high-stress situations with professional competence, but the trauma of losing Private Johnson had taught her that even the most skilled and experienced personnel could be overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. Sarah's homecoming was marked by the kind of official ceremonies and family celebrations that accompany the return of military personnel from overseas deployment. But she found herself struggling to connect with people who had not shared her experiences and who could not understand the complex emotions surrounding her service. The gap between her military identity and her civilian relationships became a source of additional stress during her readjustment period. The letter from Private Johnson's family arrived 6 months after Sarah's return from deployment. His mother had written to thank Sarah for her efforts to save her son's life, and to express her understanding that military personnel sometimes face impossible tactical situations where courage and skill are not sufficient to prevent tragedy. The letter helped Sarah understand that her grief was shared by others and that her sense of responsibility, while important, should not become a source of self-destructive guilt. Sarah's decision to remain in military service despite the trauma of the Valley engagement reflected her recognition that the mission to protect fellow service members continued to define her sense of purpose. She accepted assignment to a training position where she could share her combat experience with new pilots, helping them develop the skills and psychological resilience needed for combat operations. Her teaching was informed by hard-won wisdom about the unpredictability of warfare and the importance of maintaining human connections even under the most difficult circumstances. The final entry in Sarah's official service record for that deployment noted that she had flown 44 combat missions, engaged multiple enemy targets successfully, and contributed to the safe extraction of personnel under fire. But the statistics could not capture the most important lesson she had learned during those months of combat flying: that the difference between tragedy and survival often depends on factors that cannot be controlled or predicted, and that the laughter shared between comrades in arms represents one of the most powerful forms of resistance against the dehumanizing effects of warfare. Years later, when Sarah was asked to speak to new military aviators about combat stress and survival, she would tell them about the 3 seconds between laughter and loss that had taught her the most important lesson of her military career. She would explain that humor and human connection were not luxuries to be abandoned during combat operations, but essential elements of the psychological preparation that enabled personnel to function effectively under extreme stress while maintaining their humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. The memory of Private Johnson's laughter, rather than becoming a source of permanent trauma, eventually became for Sarah a reminder of the courage required to maintain hope and humanity in the face of overwhelming circumstances. Her own laughter at Marcus's terrible joke had not caused the subsequent tragedy, but it had represented the kind of human connection that made their survival possible and their service meaningful. In learning to laugh again despite her losses, Sarah discovered that courage was not the absence of fear or grief, but the decision to continue serving others even when the cost of that service had become painfully clear.